Amey Victoria Adkins-Jones is a star. No. She is a professor of theology at African diaspora studies here at BC. Her scholarship specializes in Mariology and womanist Black feminist thought. She earned both an MDiv and a PhD in Christian theological ethics from Duke University. She's also, on top of all of that, a Baptist minister. I actually didn't know that before.
In my free time.
She is the author of Immaculate Misconceptions, a Black Mariology, published by Oxford University, will be published by Oxford University Press this year. Please join me in welcoming Amey.
Thank you so much for being here. And as Mark indicated, I'm going to be sharing some excerpts and discussion from my forthcoming book that's out in a couple of weeks, Immaculate Misconceptions. So I would like to begin, and hopefully this all works, with a little bit of Nina Simone as you eat. Please, Lord, don't let there be an inappropriate ad. Someone asked how my teaching was going. That's a reflection.
You want to be surrounded by nature.
All right.
Don't think I'm surrounded by hotel.
Can we edit the recording? All right, here we go.
We are not shown. It was given to us to be given to you by the Lorraine Hansberry, who has long since left us. And she was my dear friend. But I'm a Pisces and I'm on the cusp of an Aquarius, and so I gotta say, take me to the water. Take me to the water. Take me to the water to be baptized. Because you see, I know that none but the righteous, but the righteous, none but the righteous shall see God. So take me to the water, cools me, child. Take me to the water. Take me to the water. Sea, ocean, and I don't mind if it's turbulent. And I don't mind if it's calm. And I don't mind if it's green. I don't mind if it's blue. But as long as it's water, then I feel at home. 'Cause it soothes me and moves me. It soothes me and moves me. Got to hide it. Cools me right down. I know.
Get it, baby. and then Maddie. Let's see if I can get back here. At least, yeah. And so I love that clip and begin with Take Me to the Water. The year is 1969, just a little down the road at UMass Amherst. And Nina Simone is in concert and begins with this sense of invocation, this reminder, this deep resonance of singing the spirituals and the blues, Take Me to the Water. But she also, through the depths of an intense political moment and in the depths of anti-Blackness, racism, political struggle, questions about the future, also still insists upon dancing and inviting others into this celebration. And so as I'm sharing some reflections today, I want us to have Nina Simone's rendition in mind, the ways that we carry grief and the ways that we carry joy, and what turning our attentions to the Black Madonna might provide in terms of helping us think theologically around what else might be possible for us besides, dare I say, all that we are experiencing under the guise of Christianity now. So, take me to the water to be baptized. It is said that water has memory, and it seems that the Paraiba River that day recalled something far more ancestral and divine than her shores had previously spoken. It was an early morning in October 1717, Brazil still a colony of Portugal, when the three fishermen set out for their catch. It was an auspicious day as their community prepared for the formal visit from the governor of Sao Paulo, who was visiting the villages beset along the river. The fishermen were in need of great supply for the banquets to come, but the river would not cooperate, their skills failing them in a moment where it most deeply mattered. Tired and disappointed, the family, João Alves, Felipe Pedroso, and Domingos Garcia, turned to prayer and asked Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception to intercede on their behalf. One of the fishermen, Alves, decided to make one last cast. And in a moment of both miracle and relief, something had finally found its way into their nets. But it wasn't the bounty they'd expected. Instead, out of the river, they raised the broken body of a small clay statue, a Madonna turned black in the water. Shocked by the discovery, the men let down their nets again, this time pulling to the surface the missing head. The fishermen cleaned and swaddled the statue with great care, and the third time they cast down their nets, they lifted to find them overflowing with an abundance of fish, a miracle. Out of the depths she appeared, a partus, dark as the waters that held her, with provision and abundance in tow. The men brought this Black Madonna home, where Silvana, Domingo's wife, Felipe's sister, and João's mother, family affair, melted wax to literally remember Mary's body. She placed the image on a small altar in their home in show of her respect and gratitude, and there a legacy of devotion was birthed to the one first known simply as Mother. She now stands ubiquitously and symbolically as the patron saint of Brazil, with millions of devoted followers and pilgrims. The shrine of Our Lady of Aparecida is today the largest Marian shrine in the world. Like so much of the Americas, the Brazil we know today was carved out and colonized through the gross enslavement of millions of Black, African, and indigenous peoples. Brazil's shores were the landing place of more enslaved Africans than any other country in the world. In this context, of the many miracles that Our Lady of Aparecida has performed, one resonates with unique sonority. The story tells of an African-descended man, Zachariah, who was enslaved in Brazil and woefully recaptured after he had attempted escape. Zechariah was forced to return by foot to the plantation from which he had run, the measures of retributive torture exacerbated by the heavy chains that shackled his body along this Via Dolorosa of return. Along the way, they passed the small sanctuary of Our Lady of Aparecida, where Zechariah requested an opportunity to pray to the Virgin. Still ensnared, he was allowed to offer his devotion only from the chapel door. As he came to his knees, the miraculous happened. The shackles locked around Zechariah's neck and body were immediately broken, falling useless to the ground. At this sign, the man who had enslaved Zechariah made instead an offering to Aparecida at the ledger value of what Zechariah would be worth as property, and Zechariah left that chapel a free person. To this day, Zechariah's chains remain on display at Aparecida's shrine. This Queen of Brazil is a Black Madonna, a breaker of chains, a dark body materialized from dark waters. Some mythologies surmise that her initial form was of a white statue of Our Lady of Immaculate Conception, brought over from Portugal. But here, along the rivers of Brazil, she took on the form she willed for herself. Black and beautiful am I. Here she rose, newly ascended, broken but impervious, and become Brazilian. Her apparition is particularly special, a Black Madonna in relationship to Black people, to the enslaved and those whose ancestors were enslaved, and her miracles yet testify as an emblem of justice. As Yvonne Gabarra and Maria Bingemer describe, the Virgin who had become Black could not but be the same one who would break unjust chains, the chains that diminished human dignity, especially for millions of people who had been uprooted from African soil and enslaved to serve the economic interests of the privileged. For those who have found themselves among the oppressed, this is not something that can be so easily taken for granted. And for a church now so deeply embedded in a Christian-colonial project of violence and expansion, often reifying structural sin and injustice, there is much for us to consider. There's something to be said in this typology of the Madonna for Black becoming, or to say, for becoming Black. There's something to be said, then, for being baptized in Blackness, and becoming Black as incarnational solidarity, and being Black as signal of divine witness and grace. There is also something to be said for a call of conversion to Blackness, as a sign of miracle and abundance, and as a signal of solidarity with those who are oppressed and those who are in search of and attempting to enact liberation. What if the appropriate petition to Mother Aparecida may best be, "Take me to the water"? So in my work, Immaculate Misconceptions of Black Mariology, I'm working to recast a vision and reclaim the significance of Mary through the constellations of the Black Madonna, as she who is often relegated to notions of whiteness and virginity within Christian-colonial enterprise and European-descended theological discourse, and often gravely overlooked beyond the confines of Catholic doctrine. The Black Madonna is, however, a critical site from which we can think and theorize differently the algorithms of oppression that manifest from purity, otherness, racism, misogynoir, and sexual violence, from the theological, anthropological locus of one who was fully human, but asked to mother the divine. If Mary, the one who's asked to mother the one who will be crucified toward salvation, if Mary is Black, what accountability must we have for the racial and gendered violences within the Christian tradition? How do we account for the divine within the theological imaginary around Black women's bodies and lives? And what dreams and visions emerge when we attest to the miraculous in her presence and bear witness to her commitments to freedom? I staged this discussion as a Black feminist and womanist theological conversation between the Black Madonna and image and icon, but more largely, stage it and argue that this is a rally against the loss of Blackness as sacred. Today, there are over 300 formal, big quotation marks, Black Madonnas, also called Black Virgins, in global existence, a majority of which pepper the European landscape. And their formality is described both by broader recognition in the Roman Catholic Church and sometimes other Orthodox Church traditions, and the miracles and Marian devotion attached to their presence, as well as their exotic presence amid landscapes of whiteness. So these numbers do not actually acknowledge the countless Black Madonnas that have existed throughout Africa and Asia since the beginnings of Christianity, doesn't acknowledge the traditions of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church or the contemporary landscape and traditions that ascribe iconicity to figures of the Black Madonna and other traditions, for example, the Azilis in Haitian Vodou. Instead, Black Madonna scholarship, limited in breadth, primarily focuses on the presence and apparitions of a Black virgin that proliferated across the European continent, mostly during the medieval era, many between the 12th and 15th centuries, where the dark flesh of these Marian icons was cited as the miraculous work of God. Their exegesis came from the Song of Songs formulation, Black and beautiful am I, and stood as symbols of power, of protection, and of unintelligible yet material speech. These were acts of God. But though initially rendered theological sites of the miraculous, it was only in the wake of modernity that the appearances of Black Madonnas began to be scientifically explained away as either separately enculturated images or simply the byproduct of physical deterioration from exposure to smoke, a breakdown of minerals and pigments in the paint, the consequences of wear and tear. With formal recognition, such sites of pilgrimage were often swallowed up inside the narratives aligned with church or state power and identity. And so I want to ask, what if she who has power to name instead and speak the language against colonialism and speak a language of the tongues of Pentecost beyond the ways that she has been named? Because though inconsistent at best, questions around whether or not images were copied with dark skin or instances where images were lightened press upon this question of the validity of the tradition. The Black Madonna's capacity for disruption becomes muted and quelled under the auspices of conversion. This is because scholars have assumed that Mary was never meant to be depicted as Black, as someone African descended. But this in and of itself is a tenuous claim. For one, we can question the notions of intent. To do so would lead us then to have to ask the question, what is the imaginary that presumes Mary to be white? But two, we might also recall that authorial intent does not predicate interpretive experience, which is to say whether Black skin and person from Africa were completely and statically synonymous or not, doesn't matter. How people viewed, interacted with, and prayed to Black virgins likely still intersects with the perception of Black-skinned and or African peoples and their presence in Europe. As Monique Shear describes, how perception and aesthetic experience are determined by culture. So this debate around intent and by extension plausibility still oscillates between extremes of exoticization and denial. Extremes that fail to take seriously a theological grammar of sacredness that encapsulates humanity without racial hierarchy. So the emergence of any image of the Black female body might be, at the least, juxtaposed with the shifts that index the incoherence of the Black Madonna traditions, and more particularly the demeaning of her Blackness within the Christian theological canon. This is not to espouse the virginity of these Madonnas and these images as a singular virtue, for the juxtaposition of Blackness and virginity means to expand the definitive lens of purity and holiness that may or may not be attributed to either quality, not to reify one with another. Instead, incoherence points us to note how the need to deny her Blackness and its materialization subtend a theological reification of Black skin as that which marks a sexually available body. How can a Black woman's body be pure, be sacred, without disintegrating the discursive dogmas that constitute the very presumption of a thing that might be known as purity or sacrality into itself? So I argue that returning to the phenomena of the Black Madonna then, whose apparitions, icons, legends can be found at the center of numerous Marian cults, is arguably one of the most critically disruptive sites of the unorthodox within the presumed orthodox, of possibility within impossibility, that has shaped a significant portion of Christian history. Yet the Black Madonnas of Europe remain fugitive in their resistance, resisting a Christian theological imagination that aligned purity and election with white skin. This is to say, a Black Mariological intervention must insist upon a Christian theological precedent for Black flesh not as unrapeable, but as inviolable. A canon that imaged Black female flesh as sacred, as a unique dimension worthy of veneration, that has been denigrated and ignored amid the European Christian-colonial project. So what I'm doing is beginning to think about and revisit a number of Black Madonnas in sacred tradition that not only ask about the notions and contours of Christian worship in relationship to colonialism and racial violence, but also ask questions about the reality of Black women, of Black mothers in the US and across the global context today. So I'm going to move to a portion that comes a little bit later, but making some connections between this idea of the Black Madonna and her relationship to the question and the conditions of Black mothering in the US now. So, mama. 2 syllables, bilabial nasal, lips pursed in smooth vibration pushing air through the nose. My infant child lingers with furrowed brow, puckered sound that requires the fullness of her face, every muscle guiding her mouth, a sputtering with force and dexterity as she attempts to tell me in her own utterance that she indeed knows who I am. A short string of enunciation lights her eyes in the sweetness of our own shared language. Mama. I wonder what Jesus called Mary, the woman who cradled her hands behind his neck as she fed him of her own body, who rocked and swayed and hummed during interminable nights that slip out of the view of our infancy narratives. She who responded to his screams and his giggles, who tickled his belly and admired the tininess of his toes, who could discern the nuances of his needs from the chord progressions of his cries. What lullabies did she sing? For of course we know that she sang. Jesus kicks her ribs and pressed his body against her organs as he stretched his limbs and expanded his lungs, rolling in the sacred baptismal of amniotic fluid. Her body drenched his need for eye thirst, allowed him to take and eat nourishment from the umbilical cord that supplied the cells forming and weaving together their holy tapestry from the creases and folds of her life. Scripture records that Jesus referred to God with affection, Abba, Father. Scripture only records that Jesus referred to his mother as woman. The absence of intimacy often feels conspicuous and peculiar, at least to me, but perhaps should intimate that there are some relations that simply can never be made legible in writing and on record. How many miracles are overlooked because they have been taken to be mundane? And surely before the Christ we know cried Abba, he cooed Ima. And when his life ended, as he breathed his last, as we are in the season of Lent, he looked for her. Mama. George Floyd enunciated his own murder before a crowd of witnesses who could not intervene without themselves possibly being killed. Floyd's murderer's badge and gun flashed toward the camera recording, his knee impinged on Floyd's neck, crushing soul and windpipe in suspended eternity. 8 minutes, 46 seconds. How often, it seems, the author of time scribbles long form in the genre of horror. There are no containers large enough to collect the liters of Black blood crying out from the sidewalks and soil of this country, built with blood at the root and blood on the leaves. George Floyd pushes oxygen through tracheal obstruction to call out for his mother, to summon her like a prophet desperate for ancestral strength, astral intervention, holy reckoning. And in the weeks to come, the banner of his gruesome death will lead a cloud of witnesses closer to the world he deserved. A war of flesh and blood, of powers, of pandemics, of principalities. How often the violence of this world demands us be subsumed by how people have died instead of how they have lived. So much of Christian thought centers on crucifixion as the height of the theological narrative, a suffering often deemed necessary to salvation and thus a marker of redemption wholesale, as opposed to pointing to the absurdities and harms that emerge when we assume thirsting for blood and power are equivocal to thirsting for righteousness. Perhaps these images of the suffering Christ, we are surrounded by them, proliferate because this is the violence we know, the violence we expect, and the violence we have been formed to endure. For often we who have experienced pain and suffering do in fact, at the least, simply wish to be seen or remembered, which must be considered cautiously with a dangerous corollary when we wish to be safe. Should not our theologies inform our assessment of threat? In times like these, it seems there are perhaps more than we realize who sit in vigil with Mary at the cross. And down at the cross, as the hymn writer describes, I ask that we consider what it means to reimagine what else might be possible in the liminal space of the now but not yet. That which seems struck down and destroyed, persecuted and abandoned, to consider what it means to still be and to birth, even amidst stillbirth. To think what sacred persists and remains, what is able to speak life amidst a world committed to death. What is possible, particularly with regard, and particularly for me and my project, what is possible with claims to Black life, which is never just Black life, in a return to the birthing pool, the living waters of initiation, to proclamation, to annunciation, and to joy. To plant seeds between the soils and systems of stratification, insisting still on new life and connection. Can we retrace lost cartographies of possibility and consider that any future we have left, especially for a theological imagination, requires seeing Black women as sacred figures and accounting for how we have or have not been delimited by a theology of Mary that has not taken seriously her capacity for Blacknesses, real and ontological and diasporic and shared. I argue for a Black Mariology that proposes pilgrimage with the Black Madonna, one that considers Marian thought beyond many of the normative claims to whiteness that masquerade themselves as finitely Christian, and that instead expands the imaginary of Black life-giving as an incarnational ethic. My conception of this emphatically plays on the theological and legislative doctrine that emerged in the Virginia colonies where I'm from in the 1600s of partus, sequitur, ventrem, the declarations that a Black child born into the world took on the status of the mother to determine if they were born enslaved or free, the blessing or curse of one's matrilineal begetting. A legality that not only encouraged the sexual exploit of Black women, but attempted to curtail the imaginations of Black futures and Black life. I'm not simply adding race to the recipes of doctrine and dogma, but asking what happens if we collate what world it is that we are born into, never of our own choosing, and asking what it might look like to actively labor to pursue what dreams we can yet hear breathing at the rim of the world. This argument goes through a number of movements, but I particularly consider the framing of Black mothering and the way that that has functioned as a barometer for the ecology of Black life and death amidst anti-Blackness through the history of Christianity. Black Mariology, as I propose, considers then a theology arising from the condition of the Black mother, a theology following the condition of the Black Madonna, and a theology for the consideration of all those who would pursue justice in life at the spiritual intersections of the world. And so in my work, one of the questions that I want to ask is about Mary at the cross. Here is an image of Mary, Mother of Sorrows, juxtaposed with the image of Mamie Till at the side of her requested open casket of her son, Emmett Till. One of the reasons I want to consider the Black Madonna, one of the reasons I want to consider the ways that the womb and Mary's womb references life, references incarnation, and for me references the place of Black life as a site of theological resistance, is because it would seem perhaps right and a logical conclusion that Black liberation theologians who considered and asked the questions of Jesus being Black might also consider where that Blackness came from. As I like to say, he got it from his mama. So in many ways, it would be a natural consideration then in a project of liberation and considering questions of justice and freedom that we consider that Mary is Black, Mary a Black mother, particularly given the proliferation of Black mothers whose children have been unjustly murdered at the hands of the state. There are legacies of Mary's birth described as painless, neat, clean, beautiful, shining, white. I've given birth, it was not that. But these legacies are reminiscent of the ways pain is misread or even ignored for and denied to Black women, imagined as something fictive and other, and the ways that Black women are denied access to their own affect. And here I look to several patristic authors, including Maximus, who speak to this formulation. There's this question for Mary about the suitability of pain as a kind of apposite response to the pronouncement of her grace. Mary's painless birth is imagined as freedom and overcoming not only the boundaries of the human body, but a spiritual ascension of the curse that's handed down to Eve. Pain isn't something that Mary deserves, so she supersedes the conditions of labor. But for Black women, particularly in the United States, the mythology of strength is not one that offers dignity. This process of ungendering, of masculinization, as several scholars have described, denies Black women the capacity for pain to a different degree, one that denigrates their humanity and relegates their position as reprobate. This perhaps, albeit quickly, moves us to the cross in our Lenten moment. Though the economy of Mary as Mother of Sorrows often subsumes the entirety of her life as a mother, from the prophecies of Simeon proclaiming the swords piercing her heart to her witness at her son's side, at the foot of the cross, Mary too embodies the pain and suffering of Jesus and thus the pain of the sins of the world. Mary, as sole progenitor of the Word made flesh, somehow stands only in the flesh, and as Hortense Spillers describes, both mother and mother dispossessed. What then does it mean if the legibility of a Black mother, still considered within the parameters of the unholy, still marked and excluded historically by pathology, made ever slightly more legible when she stands in her grief at the foot of the cross? And here I will show an image of Leslie McSpadden, mother of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. This is an inset from Beyonce's Lemonade. And some of these named mothers of the movement, a kind of photographic pietà. Sabrina Fulton, mother of Trayvon Martin, Leslie McSpadden again, and Michael Brown's mother, and Gwen Carr, Eric Gardner's mother. So at the foot of the cross, Mary is transformed from an apolitical subject to a political one by her grief. But must actual Black women, and more specifically Black mothers in America, only bear witness there? Is the testament of grief and the legacy and fulfilled prophecies of trauma forever the site of legibility, the site of theological attention? And thus the site, as mothers like Samaria Rice, mother of Tamir Rice, have articulated, of political leverage, abstracted phenomena, and gross capitalistic gain in the name of advocacy, support, and something feigned as justice. This returns me to someone like Saidiya Hartman's notion of the afterlives of slavery, the legacy of what Bell Hooks described as imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy, the legacy of what theologian Dolores Williams named as an issue of social and physical surrogacy, a theological legacy of refusal to see Black women as women, Black women as human, Black women as sacred, inside of the refusal to see Black women as mothers. Instead, they are seen as arbiters of threat and death. So what then must we imagine for the Black mother suffering to also not be offered as redemptive, to not be placed as a critical nexus of legibility in a political project of empathy or liberation, to not be an alternative modality of Williams surrogacy, which she warns us is so deeply beholden to the legacy of Black women and their wombs, to not be reduced to the canonic constraints of pastoral performativity. How do we hold space for Black Madonna as Mater Dolorosa, a mother who weeps and moans, who perhaps only wished to mother, not to mother a movement, without collapsing grief and trauma as primary register of legibility and mobilization? In other words, I question what is required theologically, not just for Black mothers to be made well, but for us to see Black mothers, those who gestate, nurture, and tend to Black life, as whole. So I see our time, and given that we are in the midst of Lent, I don't want to rush too quickly to some banner of promise, but I want to recall instead the womanist theological commitment to survivals in the here and now. These notions of this joy that we have, the world not giving and the world not being able to take away. And begin to posit a return to the icon, to the Black Madonna, as one who might speak to our suffering and yet still claim a sacred economy that braces us to resist and to hope. For this, I have to ask the questions then of thresholds and what marks the difference between drowning in the depths and the resurrections of new life. Again, what might it mean to still and yet give birth? So James Baldwin warns us, and I speak about this in my work more extensively, but I will just quote the song and refrain here. God gave no other rainbow sign, no more water, the fire next time. And I think that his quote, assuming this question that everything now is in our hands, we have no right to assume otherwise, thinking now about the times we are in the political turmoil we watch unfold hour after hour, minute after minute, day by day, is to return and ask a question then. If we are at risk of the fire next time, what might it mean to also say, please take me to the water? This is an exercise in what Andrew Prevost has described as doxological Blackness, which, I'm quoting, refers to an irrevocable fact of existence, which is not only rooted in the creative and redemptive actions of the triune God, but which is also phenomenologically evident, namely that Black is beautiful. This is simply, but also diversely and complexly, a given. To be Black is ipso facto to reflect something of the glory and word of God. For me, this is also an act of naming Blackness as icon. I'm calling this flesh to beloved. As Prevost expounds, an endeavor like this can refer to those aspects of Black culture, thought, or praxis that intentionally affirm this beloved relation to God in a doxologically rigorous manner. So to me, then, I want to ask and consider what the Black Madonna teaches us, that the good news is that the divine can occur within and between bodies. How does Black Madonna lead us to consider a vision of holding the world itself as sacred, perhaps modeled first by how a Black mother held the world within her? James Cone, speaking on the content of theology, described the earnest theological task as one that must have visions of the future because the present is unbearable. And so I'm positing a Black Mariology, unsatisfied with the world as is, that still sings the songs of Zion. For this, a commitment to sacrament over the sacrilege of squander, we must follow the condition of the Black mother, to listen and respond to to the haunting, beckoning our souls, to still be and to birth amidst stillbirth, for crucifixion is not simply consequence to incarnation. So then, take me to the water. And then perhaps it is with one whose son could walk on water that we are beckoned also to wade. Are we listening? Can you hear it? Wade in the water, wade in the water, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Thank you.
Amy, are you willing to take some questions?
Yes, I decided.
You're going to overcome your native shyness and take some questions.
Oh,
Can I begin?
yes.
As you know, I study religions in America. A large percentage of South American Christians have switched religions from Catholicism to evangelical Protestantism. Do you think does the idea of or the image of the Black Madonna, what kind of power does that have for South American evangelical Protestants? Is that a possibility, or is it too associated? The idea of the Madonna, what you've done is completely opened the possibility of considering the Madonna as a larger Christian figure and not just a Catholic one. Do you think that there's a chance that the figure of the Madonna could become something of real interest to evangelical Protestants?
Yes, possibly. I think, one of the questions that I ask, and one of the questions that you have to ask about the presence of Black Madonnas, and also the ways that Black mothers or Black deities across different, and particularly Africana religious traditions, are imagined or rejected, particularly under the guise of some sort of Christian purity, holiness, anti-demonic profession. But specifically in the U.S., in Central America and South America, you have to ask these questions of not only race and enslavement and African ancestry, but you also have to ask lots of questions around colorism. You have to ask a number of questions around what images of whiteness do, how images of whiteness, and particularly white Marian images, serve as pedagogical tools and indoctrination, and how also the often Protestant response that we don't need any of these images at all loses the capacity to think about what else is possible and to ask us to think about what we see. I'm describing and thinking about race and what is sacred in terms of icons, in terms of this theological legacy that shifts an economy, right? That proclaims holy, that is a window into the divine. But I'm also asking the question of how race is determined phenotypically by what we see. And what happens when we only see Jesus as cute, extremely Scandinavian, like the song, like very white, very blonde, very blue eyes, right? You can't even find a Jesus with green eyes or brown eyes, right? What happens when we associate these images of whiteness with salvific authority? And what happens when the only images or the predominant images of Mary that we have are ones of virginal purity, piety, that are also deeply embedded in a notion and articulation of whiteness? So are there possibilities? I sure would hope so. But this is what I'm trying to reclaim. And this is what I'm trying to argue across. And I didn't do all of this here because I didn't want everybody to go to sleep. I do this across all of, theological doctrine, right? I'm asking questions about enunciation. I'm asking questions about theological anthropology, these sort of larger, eschatology, these sort of larger dogmatic frames. But I'm also asking questions of churches. Who are in the churches? A whole bunch of Black mamas. And so what does it mean to have Black mamas, brown mamas, women, right, constitute so much of so many congregations, so much of Christian identity, and yet do not necessarily have access to the images, don't have access to the authority, and aren't able to necessarily speak out loud from formal positions to query those things. So I hope that it's possible. I think that there are ways that it might not be possible, but I contend that every movement, every revolution, every freedom dream has not come from the top down or from a majority, but those who have ears to hear.
Questions?
When is this book coming out?
In 2 weeks. It was supposed to. All right. It was supposed to be out today, so I was like, oh yeah. Well, last week, like by now, it's supposed to already be out. But I appreciate talking about it and hinting at it. You know, great expectation. Very Lenten.
Yeah. So I love what you said about Black Marys in Europe. A lot of their interest being in, or the sort of origins being in the sense of transformation. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, like theology of transformation and what that has to do with the icons and how they were approached and, I don't know, extensions of this theology of transformation.
Yeah, so I've been deeply interested, right? Like people love, like, oh, well, you know, the Black Madonnas, right? To different ends and often at times to excuses for racism or misogyny or misogynoir. And I've always wondered how one can look at a Black image and imagine, proclaim, devote oneself, you know, to its sacredness. And what is the break that doesn't translate to real people with Black skin? And how you can denigrate and deny holiness, deny humanity in these very incredibly violent and ongoing ways. And so the reason that I start with a Partusita, who is not talked about as much in this country, like people love Guadalupe. And I think that does some interesting things for us, is like, oh, the Black Madonna. But it's like, no, we actually have a lot of different stories. I turn to that story because I think that instead of thinking about, well, how did these images, you know, mistakenly become Black? What if we think about how these images intentionally became Black? And what does it mean to consider a theology inside of choosing Blackness, as opposed to it being happenstance, and certainly as opposed to denying it? So I'm intentionally sort of throughout the book playing on that reversal of what is typically thought. And I think that there are actually a lot of sites that are very easy and accessible, and we just haven't necessarily thought about it in this way, that help me to do that.
Liam?
Yeah, so thank you. I'm kind of losing my voice, but I was particularly struck by when you're talking about Mary as like a mother figure, like to Jesus, in the sense of like holding him and caring for him. And I was wondering, and also just like the relationship he had with God, and a more intimate one versus kind of a colder one almost portrayed with Mary. If you looked at any other early writings or gospels that aren't canon, and if there is more of a relationship with Mary that's more of a loving son and mother, or if it's just kind of not there at all.
Yeah. So thank you. So first I'll say that I make accusations, you know, broadly across a number. So not to be, no offense, but it's like, okay, Protestants, of which I am in a Protestant tradition, it's like they were just like, oh, Mary, you had a baby. Thank you so much. We'll just take it from here. You know, we'll just pull you out of the closet. Oh, it's time for the nativity scene. You can pop out and then, you know, hop out and show, and then I will just put you back away. Thank you so much. We're uninterested. And then you have this sort of very deep, and you know, in the Roman Catholic tradition of like, okay, well now we have to enshrine her, right? This paragon of purity, this icon of impossibility. Full virginity, full motherhood, sometimes, you know, mediate, sometimes these other things too, like Mary never wrinkles, she doesn't get old, like she's just, all of these things are imposed onto Mary's body that keep her away from anyone, and I would argue, including her own humanity. So the refrain that I shared, I wrote because I'm asking questions about what it means to return Mary, or to think about Mary, the person and work of Mary, Mariology, as fully human, but still carrying the divine, which is a parallel to how we describe the Imago Dei in humanity and what gives dignity, all of us carrying the breath of the divine as supposedly a sort of sacred ground from which we can start from. But obviously that's not the ground we're all standing on. So there's not much of Mary in Scripture at all, particularly in the New Testament. I end up using some icons that turn to her allusions in the Hebrew Bible. Much of what we sort of know and think about Mary comes from the Proto-Evangelium of James, Gospel of James. And so I get into where some of these ideas of Mary, some of these ideas of Immaculate Conception, her mother, come from. But what I think those Gospels and those sources highlight are less the human relation per se. I think we have to have some theological imagination there. But what they do highlight is the extent of Mary's precarity. Becoming pregnant as a refugee, as a migrant, as a young woman, as someone unmarried in this society is incredibly dangerous. And so I think that sometimes people are asking us to see the scandal of the cross. And I want us to ask, seeing how much courage it takes to give birth.
Thank you. This was so wonderful. You embody it in so many ways, and then also in your theology and in the presentation that images are sacred and have a lot of work to do in teaching us things about theology. So I'm wondering if you could turn to the slide with your book cover and say a little bit more about the image that you used on the cover of the book.
Yeah. So this is an image from an artist, Lena Iris Victor. This is actually a photograph of her. She uses self-portraiture inside of collage to ask a number of different questions about race and identity. And this is from a series. This particular image is called 11th. And Victor, to me, is certainly evoking images of icons or thoughts about icons. And not only with the golden halo behind herself, but also with the use of very popular Marian colors and juxtapositions of red and blue. And so when I saw this image, I was deeply arrested. It is embossed and overlaid with one of the earlier colonial maps of what is now Liberia. And is part of an extended series where it was first on display in New Orleans, where she's asking these questions of her own legacy and her own ancestry and the sort of maps and cartographies that we can follow, and also the ones that we have to imagine beyond what can be known or can be recovered. And so I love where her gaze is. I love that she is looking away. I love a number of things about this image. And so wanting to ask about what is possible, but also asking very directly how we have misconceived Black identity, Black women's identity, Black women's with an X instead of E identity within the Christian canon, particularly through colonialism. I felt like this captured a lot in terms of what I'm trying to get across. So.
And Nell gets the last question.
Right. Great. I'm so excited for this book, actually. And I'm thinking about connecting with Mark's questions about the possibilities. I can already see them because of what this is enabling me to imagine. But you had a statement in there about how you're not just adding race to extant theologies of Mary, you're doing something else. And I was wondering whether you could flesh out what you see your project as doing, as opposed to other projects you've seen that are talking about the Black Madonna, that are not doing this thing that you're doing, so that I can, to help us further imagine what could happen from this.
Yeah, so I'll start with what I don't want to do. And I don't want to make the Black Madonna great again, which is what I think a lot of more contemporary projects do. It's very sexy work, like Black Madonnas and so exotic and so fancy, and let's go back to Egypt, let's go back to all Black figures everywhere. And so I think that can be interesting work, but oftentimes it's very easy to do that casually, and it's very easy. Often those writers have been white writers. And thinking about the Black Madonna and even I would argue thinking about Blackness as something that is transcendent, right? So again, wanting to make some claim to Blackness, but not actually taking seriously, well, then what should that mean, or what that might mean for Black flesh, for Black bodies, for Black people. And so I think that there's a lot of work to be done and a lot of possibility that for me is opened up through taking seriously the Black Madonna as a figure already inside of Christian tradition, right? So it's not, there's all these questions of validity in theological discourse, and there's all these sorts of battles and debates and things that happen. And so, you can't debate the Black Madonna as this sort of newfound set of identities or questions. But I really wanted for this to be a site from which we could question theology and theological claims on a much larger and much more extensive level. So this book, in many ways, is about Black women and icons, Black Madonnas, but it's also asking questions of theological doctrine and dogma much more widely, and asking us to consider how we're thinking about suffering, how we're thinking about violence, how we're thinking about colonialism, or how we're not thinking about the ways that arguably whiteness has become an invisible norm for Christian theological discourse. And also that we're in a moment where whiteness has become a very explicit norm for white Christian nationalism. And so if we wish to resist, I don't think we have to start from scratch. I think to use Simone Weil's words, attention is a sacrament. So I'm asking us to pay attention in a different kind of way.
Please join me in thanking Amey Victoria.